Welcome to the Natural Wisdom Podcast. I'm Christine Backus, your host, and today I'm really excited to have Michelle Lundquist of Michelle's Healing Home with me, and we're going to have a very fun conversation. Hey, Michelle, thanks so much for joining me.
Hi, Christine. You're welcome. And thanks for inviting me. I'm very excited to be here and really just kind of still reeling after our conversation, too, that we just had about Saturnian wisdom. And so I feel like with this one, we're going to be able to carry some of that stuff over into our conversation today. So looking forward to it.
Yeah, I think we had so much fun last time. Yep, I'm sure it's going to be fun this time, too.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, as we get started, so today's May 9th, Thursday, May 9th, 2024, and we're in Taurus season, which is so perfect for the conversation we're having today about healing and herbs and like really practical kinds of solutions for health and very earth oriented. That's all very Taurian. We just had the Taurus new moon on Tuesday, and Beltane, the cross-quarter holy day of Beltane, where the sun is halfway between the equinox and the solstice, was technically just last Sunday. So we're in the heart of Taurus season right now. So it just seems very timely. And I just want to, so a couple of things I want to say about Michelle as we get started, and then I'll let you fill in. So Michelle's a folk herbalist. She's founded Michelle's Healing Home, and I'll put links to her both her podcast, which is also called Michelle's Healing Home, and her website in the description. And she calls herself a folk herbalist, which we're definitely going to talk about because I love that term. And in the wise woman tradition, which is very Saturnian, both of us have a lot of Saturn. And so that's to my thinking, that's sort of like the feminine face of Saturn is the wise woman, because Saturn represents the mature person, the wisdom, etc. And then just this whole concept of a lot of DIY, I want to definitely get into that as well. But first, I want to ask you what things you have coming up that you want to let us know about, and then we'll try to revisit that at the end. And then also please fill in anything I missed in terms of your intro.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it was a nice intro and it's very straightforward as I like to be and, and to the point and practical because that's one of the things that I really love about herbalism is the practicality. And I think that's one of the things that attracted me to it from the beginning. Was learning these simple ways, these old ways from traditions past, and applying it to my life now in the current age and being like, oh my goodness, this is some of the most practical stuff that I've come across.
Yeah.
And so it really fit with me and my personality and kind of my goals in life. But I've been studying and actively working with plants for over a decade now. I started back in 2013, so still have a long way to go in terms of gaining wisdom in this plant realm, in this life realm. But in terms of just having the ability to have honed in my skill into where I feel really comfortable, I feel like I've done that, and it does come through in that DIY making side of things. So even more of that practical earth-based side of herbalism, which is bringing things together to create one thing. So the alchemy of all of that. And that's where I really thrive. I also categorize myself as a homemaker. So I love everything home. I love making home. It's Michelle's Healing Home for a reason, because it was part of my big healing journey, going through a lot of shadow work when I actually kind of brought the healing home into birth, because I had a small herbal business before the healing home, and it was called Sea Goat Herbs. Capricorn, there you go. And I tried that for a couple years, but I was very early on in my herbal career. I was still learning about who I really was. Went through a big life shift, a big shadow work time, and I really wanted to find a way to blend my love for homemaking, my love for homesteading, and my love for herbs without feeling pigeonholed by calling myself Sea Goat Herbs. Like I felt like I kind of had created a bubble for myself that way. Whereas with Michelle's Healing Home, I feel like it's a little bit more broad. So I'm also a gardener, so I like to incorporate that too. And it felt more holistic to me. So that's kind of the story of the Healing Home in general. And my podcast comes out every Tuesday at 4 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. You can find it on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Podbean is another one that it's on. So yeah, you can check that out in the links below. And it's a fun journey. I learn something new every single day because that's how I kind of like to go about things too, is to be a perpetual student. I've taught classes and things in the past as well, and always kind of going into a class even as knowing that there's going to be people there that are going to have things to bring to the table to teach me as well. And I think that when you have that view about life in general, things go a little bit more smoothly than they do when you walk into the room thinking you know it all or you've been there before, and whatever, that everyone's coming to you for all this grand information. So that's one of my goals too as a teacher, I would say.
Cool. Yeah, that sounds great. And you, oh, so many directions to go. This always happens to me. So let me start with a couple of questions, just to kind of set the background a little bit. You say folk herbalist. Can you say a little bit about what folk means? I mean, I know it's DIY, but say more about that because I think that's important.
Yeah, that's actually a great question. And this is something that I realized about myself when I just like kind of stepped back from myself and tried to view myself from an outside perspective as how I approach plants. How do I approach making medicine? Who are the herbal teachers that I really looked up to and focused upon? And a lot of them would consider themselves folk herbalists. And in my opinion, what that means is the simplest form of herbalism is kind of what that is, the primordial tradition, the wise woman tradition. And I kind of like categorize this all. So, like the primordial tradition, the folk tradition, wise woman tradition. So, if I say those three, I kind of, they to me, they mean the same thing. So, I think that the wise woman tradition is kind of like has the name, the cover name of it is basically like the primordial tradition or the folk tradition, what we're going to talk about, which is basically kind of like the original way people worked with plants, or more of the holistic simple way, where it was, okay, there's comfrey growing in our yard. We know that comfrey can be used for our skin, our bones, our hair. It can be used for overall internal health because it has that mucilagenic property that is very like gel-like, almost like our blood. It is a universal healer. So, our great grandparents or their grandparents went out and harvested the comfrey, and they maybe dried it, and then they maybe used it fresh. They maybe used it as a poultice. They maybe would, dry it for tea to use later. They would do all sorts of things. They would harvest the root, and then they would make the root into things. They might just chop it up. They might powder it. They may steep it into a decoction. It's just like all these different things with one plant, and knowing that they could apply it to all different things of parts of your body and find healing in that. And I think that's kind of part of the folk tradition. As a folk herbalist, I also think too, like, I kind of struggled in the beginning with feeling like if I wasn't more of a scientific herbalist, or if I didn't have all of those constituents memorized in my mind, or I didn't know exactly what organ system was connected to this or that, I felt insecure, or I felt like I was not as good of an herbalist as somebody that was like that. So for a little while, as we typically do when we aren't sure who we are, we're more insecure, I tried to mirror that. And I realized that about myself. And that's when I took the step back. And I was like, well, how do you see this? How do you apply it in your life? Do you sit there and worry about the constituents and all this stuff, which is very important? Do not get me wrong. And I honor all the herbalists and the plant people that are more on that side, because we need all of it. We need it all in order for it to work smoothly. But once I stepped into that role of that more of a folk herbalist, knowing that simple is better, and that's just how I am, dude, things just like it like turned on. The lights went on in the house, and I felt like I was way more confident in my abilities because I stepped into the role that I feel like this is where I reside here. Even more focusing just on like introductory stuff for people, or like showing them how to make simple things, because I think foundation, and a solid foundation is key to anything. Building a house, building a teepee, building your repertoire of whatever information it is, you want to have a solid foundation. And I think that because I've focused so much on that side of things, that I have a good ability to be able to show other people how to build a solid foundation. And then if they want to go on to a more clinical herbalist, or somebody that's a clinically practicing herbalist, then they can do that because they'll have a solid foundation of all these basics. And so that's kind of where my passion for herbs lies as well. And I think the folk tradition too, it's just you can't go wrong with it. It's never going to go out of style. It's kind of timeless, in my opinion.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just point out that so many of the words you use are very Saturnian, right? That's part of what the Capricorn Cancer. Sorry, I'm bringing astrology into this, but Capricorn Cancer, the the polarity, that's about tradition, and tradition, not in the being stuck in doing it the way it's always been done, but carrying forward that tradition of our, as you said, grandparents, great grandparents. But one of the things I wanted to kind of springboard off of with what you're talking about is that what you're pointing out, which is huge for me in general, but also these days, is that we have this access to direct knowing. And if you think about the days before laboratories where people took chemical solvents and tried to pull it apart and see what the quote unquote active ingredients were, and then thought that that meant that's what the plant was about, right? People sat with plants, or they worked with plants. And one of the things we've lost in our Western culture is that trust in our own knowing, our direct knowing. And that, I think that's one of the things you just named. And I'd love to have you talk a little bit about, a little more about your journey with that. And, maybe even how you've come to trust that through your experience, because I think that's something that sometimes you just have to do it to learn. Oh, right. I do know or at least have more access to answers than I believe sometimes, right?
Yeah, definitely. No, this is a good one too. And I think what comes to me right now, and I know like in my heart, this is the answer. It was when I got more confident with my ability and tapping into my knowing, was once I became okay saying I didn't know something.
Yeah.
And I think that was another ego based thing that I think we all have to kind of deal with, is when you're asked a question, you want to know it so bad. You want to know that answer for that person. And you really, especially if you're in the role of a teacher and you're, in front of a class and whatever. But you're better off saying, I don't know. I would look into that further, or perhaps I can get back to you on that one, or whatever, instead of saying, I think it might be this, because then you're already putting yourself in that position of not being sure, right? So we're wanting to build the confidence in our ability to know something. And so I think doing the entire opposite of saying you don't know is actually going to help build a stronger foundation to be able to know, if that makes sense.
It totally does. Yeah. And it makes me think about the Zen saying, I can't remember who it's credited to, about in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In
Mm.
the expert's mind, there are few. And so it's that, saying I don't know is being open to receiving, right? And that's something that it's very helpful when you're trying to build your intuition, because that's what you're doing, is receiving.
Yeah. And it wasn't always easy for me. Believe you me, I think it's easier for some people. I've always had, I think it is the more earthy Capricorn side of me being a little more stubborn, or a little more, you want to, like we talked about in our conversation, you want to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
So in our minds, in our egoic mind, the impractical egoic mind, I should say, we think that if we say we don't know something, that we're not going to be respected, or we're not going to be taken seriously, because someone might, and that's all projection on our part. Because I
Right.
think most people would rather be talking to or learning from someone that has the ability to say they don't know versus, kind of that, I think that's what it is or whatever, that unsure sort of thing. So, but yeah, it took me a long time. I would say it took me a good long while to get more comfortable with that. And actually, Mario, my fiance, being very helpful in that with me, being gentle with me, or reminding me of saying like it's okay if you don't know, and when you have somebody in your life, particularly a partner or a family member or a friend who can be very forward and honest with you, I mean, these are the people that are worth their weight in gold, really, because as much as their advice might hurt or it might be tough love or something, it's like that's going to benefit you longer for more in the long run than it would be if somebody kind of just fluffs you up constantly, or it's always, oh no, it's great, oh it's great, but not everything is always great, and that's okay. And that's one of the things about the wise woman tradition that I love too, is it's more realistic like that. Like it is more about tough love. It is more about showing these sides of ourselves that aren't as pretty or aren't as refined or whatever, and being okay with what's going to come back and then learning from that, and that's been a really beautiful thing for me, and very healing, like deeply healing
Yeah,
and humbling.
yeah, and humbling, exactly. And that makes me think about, one of the things I've been sort of riffing on and teaching lately is this idea that, and it goes directly to what you're talking about, when you're in certainty, that's a form of control, right? Trying to stay in control, have all the answers, I'm the expert, blah, blah, blah. And it's not how the world works, right? And what you're talking about is being in this conversation with life, and in a conversation with the plants, and in a conversation with the medicine, so that there's more of an exchange and there's a listening in addition to a telling. And that, I think that's super important. And the other thing that I wanted to sort of the next question I wanted to go off on, and just to set it up, is that, and I was just listening to your latest podcast with Mario, and I just a quick shout out. Anybody that's listening to this that hasn't heard my episode with Mario, Mario Garza is Michelle's fiance, and he's just delightful too. I mean, and then listening to the two of you is super fun. So, but in your latest conversation with Mario, you were talking about urine therapy, which we're definitely going to touch on today. And one of the things that you were mentioning is something that is so, it's actually heartbreaking to me, because it happens a lot. Like, I do a lot of hiking in nature, right? And those of us that work with nature and try to have that relationship with nature, we've been taught to be afraid of everything, right? If you're walking around in the woods and there's a plant that you don't know and you want to kind of get to know it, what's one of the very first things we want to do? Smell it and taste it. And there's so much stuff out there about how dangerous we're taught to be afraid of the water in the wilderness. We're taught to be afraid of the plants. We're definitely taught to be afraid of the animals. And that, I mean, that sort of, that fear, approaching life and approaching the natural world with fear. I'd love to talk for you to talk about, like, how did you get through that? Because you were brought up probably the same way I was. And what's your experience, and what do you tell people about it?
Oh yes, I love this topic, by the way, because that is how things are. I mean, we're taught to fear, like literally, subliminally, we're taught to fear dandelions. I mean, think of that.
Yeah, exactly.
In culture, we're taught to fear them because they're gonna make our yard look gross or something. I mean, give me a break, And so instead of letting them flourish or using them as medicine, you spray them, I mean, that's always a classic go-to when you're kind of talking about this sort of level of fear that is put out there. Yeah, for me, it was all about experience. It was literally just getting out there and starting to realize that there really is not much to fear, as long as you are cautious in your own way, but not being fearful, but like being aware. I think
Yep.
like being aware and being present is probably like the best piece of advice for all things in life, but particularly when you're out in the wilderness. As you said, you're a hiker, so you have to be aware of your surroundings. I mean, you can choose to not be, but that's when things will arise, literally twisting an ankle because you didn't see a rock or a root, not listening to the wind shifting, or not listening that there may be a bear approaching or something like that. So I think just being aware and being present has been the biggest thing for me. Just more on like a practical level too, or like a physical level, getting yourself plant identification books for your region. Or I know a lot of people now like plant apps, but that for me was my first step, was like, okay, well, I'm just going to get a couple of ID books for the region. So when we're out and I don't know something, I can look it up or what have you. But one of the other things that happens too, even in like the herbal community, not even just the herbal community in general, but basically like there's all these kind of fear-based things about how you should harvest and when you should harvest. And by all means, I would never tell someone to go and harvest like a whole field of something and not be mindful of what you're taking and stuff, but I think that there's certain plants and certain things that they say that we shouldn't harvest, and I almost wonder if they tell us not to harvest it because it's so valuable for us. Because when you do the research on some of these plants, they're not poisonous, they're not going to hurt you, they're actually very gentle. And so why is it that we can't harvest some of these things, or we have to be more aware of that? It's like if you're aware and you're respectful in general, I think that most people who are respectful aren't going to go overboard, and you're only going to take what you need. And that's basically another rule of thumb that I live by too, is like take what you need. You don't, if you only have a small family, or you're making just a batch for yourself, then take a couple handfuls of that St. John's wort flower, or whatever it might be, and be mindful of it. Also to making like not being afraid to ask questions about something or how to ID something is one of the bigger things. And I think also that goes back to that tapping into your intuition. The plants that are poisonous typically have indicators that you will be able to see, and it's usually color, and they're usually more of the poison plants, they might call them, or the nightshades or whatever, are ruled by Saturn sometimes. And a lot of them will have like a dark purple or a red color going through their stem or something like that. And like I always, do your research. I'm not saying that all the poison plants have red stems or spatterings of red or whatever, but there's usually like a deeper purplish color or something going on. There's usually like a indication of flowers. Sometimes there's imposter plants that look a lot like things. The one that comes to mind is there's a plant called blue camas, and there's a plant called death camas. And I had actually a run-in with that myself, and I can briefly talk about it, just to give a brief explanation of my experience. So I was on a hike with my friend, and I saw a plant that looked a little bit like, I didn't know what it was. It had a really nice blue flower on it. It looked kind of like a grass. It looked a little bit almost like asparagus to me or something. And I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And I just took a little piece of it and I nibbled on it. And then I'm like, oh, I should look in my book. Well, first point, look in the book first if you're not sure, and then eat it. Okay. So there's number one where Michelle kind of maybe went wrong. And then I'm like, oh boy, this looks a lot like death camas. And my friend just froze. Like, she was terrified. And I personally was more like, okay, well, I may have just eaten this. And if I did, the first thought I had, which is kind of crazy, was how is my friend Vanessa going to get me down off this mountain? That was the first thing I thought of. And then I thought to myself, and you know what? If I die of eating death camas on this mountain, I would be okay with it. So there was like all of these revelations that kind of came through. And I thought, okay, so we're just going to take a little bit of time. We're going to sit down for 10 minutes and just pay attention to my body, see what happens, drink some water, whatever. And I was like, you know what? I think I'm good. I think it was blue camas because the flowers hadn't opened yet. It was like just about ready, So that's just a little example of how quick something could happen. Thankfully, it wasn't death camas, and thankfully, it was blue camas, and it wasn't that big of a deal. But that's an example. So, learning from those sorts of things, that made me like so much more hyper aware. And this just happened to me like 3 years ago, and so that's just how it can happen to people. Even you hear stories of people, oh, wow, they were really experienced, but they actually ate the wrong mushroom or whatever it was. It can
Right.
happen to anybody. So I
Right.
think like the awareness, the being present again comes in really strong, and not just like taking something without really thinking about it or maybe looking it up first if you're not sure. Those would be my advice for all of that, but not to fear it. It doesn't mean you
Right.
can't step foot into the forest or ever taste a plant again. It's just taking that second to like think first before you do anything, I think is just the
Yeah.
best way to be.
And I think one of the things you said that's so interesting to me is that you sat down and basically you were with your experience and your body, right? And I don't know this, and maybe you do know the answer to this, but I wonder if taking a little taste, even of death canvas, is really going to just kill you in an instant, right?
Right.
I think there's a lot, again, this goes back to that fear programming. And, if you usually the other way that something is poisonous is by the taste, not always, but it's not usually going to taste good. And so that's the other way that we know. And we hear stories like we had somebody not too long ago here in Montana who had some kind of mushroom that died from mushroom poisoning at a restaurant. So obviously there were some poisonous mushrooms that got mixed into the local harvest because they were serving local stuff. But I don't know even there, like what was the volume? If I'm pretty careful with mushrooms because I know nothing about identifying them. But even then, I wonder, and I think it's like, I guess what I'm trying to get at is that yes, err on the side of caution, and you're probably not going to die from nibbling on a little piece of a poisonous plant, right? And you're probably going to find out what its effects are pretty quickly if you stop and pay attention or notice what's going on with your body.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And that was one of my other conclusions was like, I remember sitting there and going, I ate such a little bit of this, like a little nibble that I can't imagine, right, that this would take me out. The other thing too is when it comes to poison plants, they're really potent medicines too.
Yes.
So we have henbane and we have mandrake, we have datura, all of these wonderful plants that are considered poisons, but when they're used responsibly, when they're used at drop doses, when they're used only topically, these are the types of plants that bring you to situations that I was in sitting on a mountainside contemplating, listening to my body. That's what those plants want you to do, right? They want you to tune in. So, a lot of times, those medicines can be super healing in a lot of ways. And that's the other thing, too, where the fear program of all this stuff comes in. And it's the dose is what's the most important, really, at any time. And I sometimes even use non-poisonous plants in just drop doses,
Right.
specifically working with trauma or emotional health or, whatever it is. Maybe you don't feel like you need to have a whole dropper full of your hawthorn berry tincture. You just want to have a drop and see what happens, like kind of experiment too. Be your own mad scientist on yourself is one of my mottos as well, of like, whatever you are going to put out into the world, you should probably try it on yourself at least a few times before you're putting it out there. That's another thing I've learned, make sure whatever you're sharing that you actually like, you're actually happy with, and that you actually are enjoying yourself, or you could, impart onto somebody what it's doing for you. I think that's really valuable medicine as well.
Yeah, and that the plant that I was thinking about as you were saying that too is elderberry, right? I mean, we by now we probably all know that elderberry is a magical plant when it comes to immune systems and this and that and the other, and it's poisonous, right?
Right.
You just go start grabbing elderberries and eating them, that there's a lot of, isn't it, is it cyanide, right?
Yeah.
Cyanide.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
the seeds.
And so it's the how you prepare it that, and yet, again, if you go into the forest and go grab a few elderberries and eat them raw, again, I don't think you're going to keel over. And most of us have probably tried it at one time. So
Yeah.
it's, and I think the other thing I wanted to point out, and then I'll let you talk about that, is that you use the word respectful. And if I've been thinking about, I need a little, like a top 10 ways of co-creating your relationship with nature, and being respectful would be at the top. Whether it's a plant or an animal, there's like, that's one of the like rules of engagement, is being respectful. And you mentioned that. And that to me, that makes sense and it kind of captures a lot of what we're talking about here.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And that to me is one of my biggest things that I try and do all the time, like really tune into the plants in that way and treat them as though they're people,
Yeah,
it
absolutely.
and the age old kind of motto of treat others as you'd like to be treated, and thinking of the plants in that way too. And I think plants want to be used as medicine. I think they're here for us. They've been put here for a reason, as we have, and we have like a symbiotic relationship with them. And I think that there's so much crossover with plants and us that we can tap in, we can listen, and we can respect them, and they'll respect us by offering up their medicine to us. And I think that's one of the things that I really love to I like to go through the garden, and there'll be plants that really speak to me during certain times, and then I'll say, okay, yep, I'll make medicine with you soon or whatever. And then sometimes they're like, no, do it now. Like, do it now. It comes through like that. And it's not like your mom telling you, yelling at you to clean your room. It's not that kind of like shout or anything, but it's like fills your body. And when you are in tune with your intuition, you know what that feels like. And all of us have the ability to feel these things. It's just if you're used to it or not, or if you're exercising that muscle, that's when it really kind of starts to come through. And that's how I work with the plants for sure. And one of the ways that I like to respect them is if I am going to harvest medicine from something, from a plant, I always leave an offering, which is typically my hair, which sounds weird to some people. I'll take just a piece of my hair and put it at the base of the plant and thank the plant. And then also what I like to do if I'm somewhere, if I'm out wildcrafting and I know the area is clean, it hasn't been sprayed, or if I'm in my garden, I love to sit next to the plant that I'm making medicine with, because I feel like that is a really good way to respect the plant by literally showing the plant what you're doing with her, is like, hey, I am so appreciative of this medicine and I want to show you how I'm going to prepare you. And that to me kind of like comes into the medicine, it goes into whatever you're making, and it's part of the intention of kind of just being open to more of that etherical realm that the plants like to be in. And they're also physical too, just like we are, but they can step between these worlds really easily. They can be physical really fast, but then they can also be etheric and have their means of communication with us and the animals. And once you start noticing this stuff too, you do notice more of the language of the birds, or the green language comes through in all these different ways, that you'll have a different relationship with the trees in your yard and the grass that grows and all of that stuff. So I think that's what it comes down to. And when you put that respect out to the plants, they bring it back to you, just as it happens in life.
Yeah, that's another thing that's been sort of on my mind lately, is that that whole idea of relationship. And well, like an example in my life is that, we have a little bit of property, my brother and I, up in the mountains, and people want to come hunt. And
Mm,
my, even if they're good, respectful hunters, part of my problem with it is that that's the only thing they want. They want to come get and take something away, right? And I'm not saying that you can't go collect plants or take an animal or whatever from a place where you don't live, but there's something about creating a relationship with the place and having sort of an ongoing relationship, which is probably why the garden, I mean, when you've got a garden, there's a definite cooperative relationship, right? You're supporting the plants and then they're supporting you. And I wonder if you could talk about that a little bit, like what you just said about sitting with the plants. To me, that's like recognizing this is a relationship and I'm not just here to take stuff, right? So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, no, that's a good one too. I think part of it for me is taking a little, like we are talking about, taking what you need. And I can see your hesitancy of not wanting hunters on your land like that, because in hindsight too, when you really look at it, it's like there's plenty of places for people to hunt that doesn't
Mm.
have to be private land as well. And I understand that mentality, because I think that that's your boundary. It's keeping your space sacred. And I think that's the same thing like with the garden. So if I know that I like to make blue vervain tincture, which I love, it's one of my strongest plant allies for multiple reasons. I make sure that at the beginning of the season that I start a lot of blue vervain seeds, and that I know that I'm going to want to make a decent amount. So if I'm going to take a decent amount from my blue vervain plants, I want to plant out, that in return or something like that. Even though blue vervain, it's a perennial, at least where we live. It's pretty abundant. It grows really well. It can grow very tall and it will take over a space if you allow it. But it's like, I don't know, the more you can kind of return that back, because sometimes the plants don't make it. I remember last year just pulling weeds and the blue vervain. One of the plants it was super small still, and I pulled it out. And right as I pulled it, I was like, "Oh no, that was a blue vervain," and I felt really bad about it. And I reburied it, and I was like, "Oh, I hope you come back or whatever." And then I noticed this year that it didn't come back. But what I did notice, that the other plants that I had planted are like even bigger and stronger this year. So just these little things like that. And
Yeah.
that's one of the things too, is one of the best pieces of advice that I've gotten as a gardener is, if you plant something, as soon as you plant it, let it go, because you don't know what's going to happen. And I think like the plants appreciate that. I appreciate that, because then I don't beat myself up as much if something does go wrong, or I accidentally pull something up, or a hailstorm comes through, or the deers come by, or whatever it is. It's like that instant that you put it in the ground, it's like you have to like let that go, just like we have to let go a lot of things in order for them to flow. But yeah, that's something that I think about. Or I like to make really small batch things. So that's kind of like my jam, actually, is making super small batch artisan handmade products that might only come out once. Maybe whatever plant it is that I'm working with, maybe it didn't do as well that year. So I only could make one small batch of 10 bottles of tincture or something like that. And then you have to wait till the next year. And
Mm.
that's what I love about wise woman tradition too. And folk herbalism is that you work with what you have. And so it was last year, actually, that example with St. John's wort. The year before last, it was just everywhere. There was one of the biggest plants in our garden that I've ever seen of a St. John's wort. And last year, that plant, that big old plant that was so glorious, I made a lot of medicine from, didn't even come back. And I was like, wow, okay, well, I'm not going to make St. John's wort this year. Could I have gone out and found it? Absolutely. Yes, I could have. But I just decided, I'm like, well, let's focus on something else then. And then we'll see if it comes back again next year. So I think patience is a really good way to manage how much herbs you're using, or how many plants you're using, knowing that you can make a decent amount of something. Like with mullein, you can literally harvest 20 leaves of mullein, and you're not going to even maybe notice much of anything. You know, comfrey is another one like that too. You can go to a big old comfrey patch and get a decent harvest, and it's not even going to look like you even touched it. So I think there's different plants that produce in big ways. Those are the ones that you can maybe put bigger dents in, than something that's a little more sparse, like trillium or something like that, which is one of the plants that people are usually, it's like on a watch list or something, you know, because
Right.
it does take a long time to grow. Speaking of patience, you know, it can take a decade for a big old patch of trillium to develop, and plus, you know, so just these little mindful things, I think, and looking at what's the pattern of the plant, how does it like to grow, that might give you a measure of how it actually would like to be harvested. Because something like comfrey actually benefits from being harvested in a big way. You know, you want to kind of cut that back. You want to dig it up, because otherwise, you know, you let it go for 5 years and you're just going to have comfrey everywhere.
Yeah, to me, what was coming to me is like there's a natural spirit of generosity if you respect kind of what the plants got to offer in that moment. And I think that's a great point, is that, you know, like if you get caught, like if you're talking about your garden, but definitely if you're talking about wildcrafting, there are going to be some years you can't wildcraft something because there was such a poor harvest. And in our area, up on our land, one of the things I love to make is hawthorn extract. Like I use, I do both a tincture and like a syrup out of it, and I love it. But we had zero hawthorn berries last year because of the weather. The weather just knocked off all the blossoms. So yeah, I could have gone somewhere else or I could have bought them, but it was just like, okay, this year I'm not going to get hawthorn. And it's that sort of, again, just understanding that it's partly like not being in control, right? That and the Western sort of the Western view is you can always get anything you want. Well, not if you're working with nature and working with land and your garden and whatever it is. I love that. Work with what you have, and you might have to wait until next year.
Oh yeah. No, I love that. That's a great story. And hawthorn, yeah, that's a good one. I love hawthorn too. That's really cool.
Yeah, so are you up for switching it up a little bit? Because I really want to
Oh
go
yeah.
to the urine therapy discussion.
Yeah,
It
let's do it.
a friend of mine is doing this. She's working with it, and she's actually how I found you. She's also an astrologer, and she sent me to your podcast. And so I was listening to your discussion this morning, and I know a little bit about it from studying Ayurveda, although I never was somewhere where it was prescribed. But I wanted you to talk a little bit about, there's several things on my mind. I'm just going to dump them all out there and then you can pick and choose. I have done urine therapy where I've taken urine and poured it on my garden when I had a garden, because that, you know, then the plants adjust for you, right? That's one thing I heard. And I mean, I can't give you any proof about it, but that's one area. The other is, of course, I'm curious how you came to it. And then the third one, and I'm just going to say from my perspective, I've tried it. I'm not done trying it. I haven't tried it very much, but I have a hard time with it because I just don't like the way it smells or tastes. So I want you to talk about all of that. And then people that are listening may think I'm nuts. They may think you're nuts, but yeah, it's a great topic and we don't have a ton of time, but I want to at least kind of dive into it a little bit in the context of this, you know, folk medicine, what's freely available, and this knowing from the inside, right? That we've talked about.
Yeah, you know, I'm glad we're going here. And I put it in my notes actually, because it's like last night I went into Mario's office and I asked him some question about urine, and he goes, pee pee on the brain. And I was like, yes, it is totally on my brain, and in a good way. Like I feel like it's one of those things where I don't know. I just see all of this stuff happening with it in the future in terms of like for my own self. Like I just feel a resonance with it. And I think it comes back to wise woman stuff, because wise woman tradition is all about nourishment. And it's all about all the things we're talking about: what's available, what's easy, what's simple, what are you doing, what comes from within, because that's what wise woman is all about too. It's all about self. It's all about like going within for the answer. And urine is within, it comes from within you, it's within you, it's without you. So if you're consuming yourself, like I literally feel like I'm consuming myself when I'm doing it. And someone might sound like that's like egoic or some like conceited sort of thing, and it's like, no, 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 it's like I'm also consuming all the things that I don't maybe like about myself, because it's all in there. All the insecurities, all the underlying things, all the beautiful things, everything is in there. So it's like now when I drink it, I've flipped my mind to because the first time wasn't easy. First and second time, I gagged, I didn't like it. I'm like, oh my God, what am I doing? If my mom and dad only knew, like, whatever,
Yeah.
you know? Anyway, but then now I flip it. I'm like, no, 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 I am nourishing myself like in the deepest way I can on all sorts of levels. And once I did that, then now it has become way easier for me, because I'm like, oh, this is way easier to swallow down than something coming up, that I really excuse my stuttering, but there's a saying where it's basically kind of the idea of continuously work on yourself and your health so that you don't have to be like laid out and then start thinking about it.
Right.
Yes, we all come down with things, we all get injured, it happens, it's going to happen, and it has to be accepted when it happens. But if you can take as many measures to not get there, you're going to be better off when you do get there, because it might not take you as long to recover or something like that. So that's also the mentality that I'm putting in, is like I'm like putting money in the bank, baby, when I do this. Every time I drink it, that's what it feels like. It's like gold in the bank. And that's kind of one of the things I first came about it. Well, there's two ways. I really love a woman by the name of Dr. Amanda Vollmer. She is one of the people I look up to in such a great way. She is a teacher. She's an herbalist. She's a healer in her own right, a medicine woman, and she talked about it a lot. And so she's kind of the first avenue of where I've heard it. And then our really good friend Miri, she was started doing it a couple of years ago, and she came to visit us, and she was just talking about it. And Miri, she's probably in her late 50s, early 60s. And I hadn't seen her in a couple of years, and she looked amazing. I mean, she's glowing. She's always very vital. She is very conscious of her health, but her hair just looked great, and it was thick and flowing. And she just had this vibrancy to her. And she's like, well, I've been drinking my pee for like a year. And we were all kind of like, okay. Oh, whoa. Okay. So she is doing that. So we kind of poked fun at her for a second. And then I was like, well, I have heard about this, and living proof right here. She's doing pretty good. And so, anyway, I think slowly, just like hearing it and thinking about it, then Mario actually came across some more information, more towards like the primordial tradition, sacred center stuff in one of the Telegram groups he's in, and a bunch of these men talking about doing it. And I think it inspired him for the same reasons, as like, wow, this sounds like this is probably the best medicine that you can take. And so he kind of posed it, and I said, hey, I've been wanting to try it for years, so let's just do it. And so we both started consuming it on a daily basis. So it's coming on almost 3 months. It's like 2.5, a little over 2.5, I think. So we've just been doing the fresh urine. I have aged it and used it as well. But yeah, I mean, the results have been fantastic. And I really encourage people to do that. And if they want to hear more about like our personal experience, you can check out our episode. It's on the Healing Home YouTube, at Michelle's Healing Home on YouTube. And we just launched that this Tuesday, actually. And we kind of talk about more of our personal experience with it. And yeah, that's kind of where I stand with it right now. And I don't see any reason to stop. That's how I feel. And I know that's how Mario has been feeling, how we've been talking about it. And I'm just starting to want to experiment with it more, actually. And I want to do some studies on myself and really like concentrate and like in a serious way of like recording things, taking photos of myself, really like recording my thoughts, my feelings, and doing some more focused studies for me. And then so that I can kind of share that out with the world, so that I can get a little bit more concrete evidence, I guess, going from my own experience as to what I'm really experiencing with it. And yeah, it's pretty cool. It feels like a game changer. It's one of those things where I've been like, this whole time, seriously, like this whole time this has been here. And wow. So anyway, it's cool to
Well,
hear that you've tried it though, because I mean, there's people that they are not even open to even trying, you know?
yeah, well, the first time I heard about it was when I was getting ready to go to what's known as a panchakarma, which means 5 actions, which is a sort of a cleansing and renewal in India. And somebody said, well, you're going to have to drink your own urine. And I was like, what? That sounds awful. And I'd never been to India at that point, but, and they never did. I mean, that just was never part of what we did. But it's always been in my mind, that I'm always been curious. And then listening to Emily, my friend, talk, and then I got to starting with it. But I'm curious, you don't have to go into like a lot, but I'm curious, like, what are the top things that you've noticed that you attribute to that? And I understand it's not like the big experiment and you haven't done all the variables and all, but I'm curious, like, what's just your first initial cut? Like, what have you noticed that has made a difference with it?
Yeah, great question. So, calmness, feeling more centered and
Mm.
feeling less anxious. And I don't know what, it was just like one day we were talking about something that typically makes me stressed out. Typically, I would go more to like an anger place or whatever, and it didn't bother me. And I literally didn't even think about it. And Mario was like, wow, I really appreciate how you're reacting to this. And I'm like, oh, thanks. And he goes, like, it's a noticeable difference. And I was like, oh, yeah, I've been feeling more calm. I've been feeling more patient and just less anxious in general, like less projective thought. And to me, dude, I mean, that is enough for me to never stop, because I said this in our video, but that has been an area of life that has been really, I've struggled with that. And I think it's because I was raised more of in a typical American household, I guess, but like lots of scarcity was like kind of pumping through the home and things like that. I love my parents, I love my mother, but there was a lot of there's just more scarcity mindset, and so I lived my life that way for a long time, always more in scarcity. And it wasn't until, like a decade ago or so that I really, really, really saw how much I was in that mindset,
Yep.
And so it's been kind of a journey for me to really kind of break that programming. And so to have Mario notice it, who's somebody who knows me really well and sees my patterns and isn't afraid to call me out on them, for him to notice that. And then I was like, yeah, you know what? I've been feeling way more centered. And I typically feel very centered and grounded, but I think it's one of those things where this just took it to a new level. And so for me, that's huge. That was like one of the first things. And then the second was hormonal balance in terms of menstruation. So I'm 40, so I'm still menstruating. I don't really have, I would say I've had like a few things that seem premenopausal, but I feel like I'm still in the younger ages of that. So in terms of menstruation though, oh my goodness, like my period the last two have just been easy breezy and almost no fatigue, really no cramping hardly at all, just that in and of itself. And my periods are pretty balanced. I'm usually pretty on schedule and things like that. Haven't had like too intense of pain over the last like 5 years or so, but I just noticed a difference. I noticed more vitality. Like I was actually able to go out and garden in a more strenuous way than I typically do if I'm bleeding, which I usually allow myself to rest on those days. So I'll do like simpler tasks, but it didn't take it out of me, as much as it typically does. So that was a big thing for me for sure. And I think like that's what I hear from a lot of people too, is that hormonally it really helps to balance men and women out in a really big way. And the third thing that really came through strong, because it was something I was noticing, was that I was having more urgency to urinate. And I chalked it up to, okay, just turned 40. I guess that's what happens. You turn 40, you're starting to get old, quote unquote, that's not even old, really, in my opinion. But And so I was just noticing that, like I'd feel like I'd have to pee, and then I'd go to the bathroom, and it was like a really small amount. I'm like, why did I feel like I had to like unload right here, you know? Or I was waking up multiple times a night to go number one or go pee. And that has totally stopped since
Hmm.
I've done the urine therapy. And that was probably about a month. After a month is when I really started noticing a lot of this stuff, particularly the calmness and the urine. I don't know, what is that called? It's not urine retention, but there's a frequency to urinate or something. I think there's like a technical term
Right.
for it. And so those three things have been really beneficial and revolutionary for me. And those would be the top ones off the top of my head, but there are more for sure.
Well, that's great. I mean, just the first one. I mean, how many people do you work with if you do any kind of clinical work? I mean, a lot of my clients that come to me are about anxiety, and just working through the anxiety piece is huge. But then for women in that age period with menstruation and balancing the hormones, and then of course the last one, that takes me off into, we have so many lies and programming, so much programming around aging and what happens to women, and it's all BS, right? It's
Yeah.
not true. It's not inevitable. It's just not the way it works. And this is just a great example of, well, maybe there's something going on, and we just, the medical establishment just is like, oh yeah, that's just what's going to happen, so nobody's paying attention. That's a rant, and that could go for another hour. But coming back to this, what did I want to say about that? I mean, when I think about urine therapy, and I haven't done any research into it, but intuitively what I think is that you're giving your body feedback,
Yes.
right? Your body is going, oh, okay, now I get it, and I need to adjust for this. And so I think that's part of what's going on. Then I know you've talked about it in terms of nourishment, but I had never thought about it on beyond the physical biochemical level. So I love what you're noticing on the spiritual, mental, emotional level, because that makes total sense that it's more of a holistic feedback loop, at all those different levels. And so I'm really glad you're willing to talk about that, because this is actually the second time it's come up on the show, but this is the first time I've had an actual conversation about it. And I'm going to keep going with my own experiments. And because I think what you were saying about, yes, it was hard at first. I mean, some of that's probably mental, some of it may be emotional.
Yeah.
And so that's some of it. But so last question on that. If somebody wants to get started, if somebody wants to become a closet urine drinker or a potty urine drinker, either way, what would you recommend?
I would recommend, now this is just from my very beginner standpoint, obviously.
Okay.
I recommend getting yourself a small glass. What I started out with was one of the mason jars, like the jelly jars. I think they're like 8 ounces, the little crystal-y looking ones. And just put it in the bathroom before you go to bed. And if you wake up in the middle of the night, or you can wait till the morning, just have that glass ready and get yourself like an ounce of it. It doesn't have to be a lot, you know. And if you don't quite want to drink it right then and there, like from the tap or whatever, you could take that ounce and save it, and then like put it into some juice in the morning, or put it into a smoothie and like mix it into something. And you can like psych yourself out and like not even remember it's in there, or whatever. But that's what I would recommend. I held my nose the first time, you know what I mean? I did the
Yeah.
whole like aversion sort of thing, and that may have been part of my like mental block that I just had to get over. But yeah, I mean, I've been doing straight from the tap, which seems crazy to a lot of people, I'm sure, but it's like there's something about it. Like I take a second, like I have it, I hold it in my hand, I just take a second, and I just like remind myself, like, you are doing this for yourself and all the people that you love and who love you. Like that's kind of like that's how I remind myself when I'm exercising or something, is like, this is for yourself, not even in like a selfish way. It can be a little selfish if you want it to be, but like thinking of it in terms of that. And then remembering the benefits. I think remembering is a big thing for me that I try and do, and not in like a nostalgic way, but like before I I've had to work really hard like with diet and food, having like food addiction sort of like things. And before I eat something, having to say, like, remember the last time you ate that? How did it make you feel? Like, really sit in that memory. And, we have memories of things that aren't as positive, and then we have things that are positive, obviously. And with the urine therapy, all the memories are pretty damn positive. So I'll think of that. So that would be my top recommendation for people to get started, and just start slow. And you don't have to tell anyone if you don't want to. Maybe if you do have a partner that's open minded, and you might like present it to them, always doing it with somebody else can sometimes be helpful too, especially someone you trust and you love, and the feelings are mutual. That can be helpful, because I know that did help both Mario and I. Like, he was on board, and I'm like, oh, let's do it. Like, there's no reason, to not. So yeah, and listen to your body, because I've done a lot of traveling over the last couple of months. And there were a couple times while I was traveling where I'm like, I'm not going to drink it today for whatever reason. Doesn't feel like I need it or something. Just like a supplement, I deal with supplements in the same way. I don't take a lot of supplements, but I take like a B vitamin or something, and I'll literally hold the bottle of B vitamin in my hand. Do I feel like I need this, or am I just taking it out of habit? So it's okay to be like flexible with yourself too. I don't think you have to be like militant about it. People can be if they want to be, but I think just like the whole thing is like trying to teach us to tune in a little bit more, I think, is what urine therapy wants us to do. So keep all those things in mind. And I think that you'll find your way and how you like to do it just by doing that in and of itself. It'll be a wonderful experience if you let it be. There you go.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And and what I took out of that it kind of comes back to ritual, right?
Mm,
Ritualizing it, that part of remembering and sort of and the respect and the honor that you're doing it with. I mean, it matters so much like how we do things, and whether it's plants or eating meat or whatever it is. And the urine therapy, it has a lot to do with that respect and the ritualizing of it. So that's beautiful and that's very helpful. Yeah. And I've
yeah,
always
good.
heard, and
Thank
you
you.
tell me if it's true, I've always heard that like the first one in the morning is probably the best one.
That's what I've been hearing. That's what I've been doing. I recently learned something too. I found a guide. It's like through a Chinese medicine website and he's a doctor. And he talks about uh, allowing yourself to pee just a little bit, like clear your urethra for like,
Yeah.
I don't know, 2 seconds or something, and then grab the urine from the midstream.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, because, yeah, so you've probably heard that. So sometimes at the end, like if there is sediments or anything like that, like that'll be there. You can drink it, it's going to be fine. But in terms of taste, I found that just doing that over the last couple days, getting it from midstream seems to be a little bit more gentler in flavor wise. So that could be something to experiment with as well. And that makes total sense to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Wow.
Yeah, I know. And I just like it's crazy how we just don't know what we're going to be doing 2 years down the road or whatever. And here I am doing urine therapy, and I am like ready to just like go full board and talk to people about it and help them with it and get more experience under my belt so I can do that in the future and stuff. And yeah, I mean, it's pretty cool. So I'm actually really grateful to have to be in the place that I'm in right now, to be able to do it, because I think it does it's I don't think I would have been ready to do it. I wasn't ready to do it 6 months ago because I wasn't doing it. And even it wasn't even on the radar or whatever. So to kind of get to this point, I feel like it shows a lot in many ways, like emotionally, spiritually, and physically. And that doesn't mean that people who don't drink their pee aren't emotionally, physically, and spiritually like sound or anything. By
Right.
no means do I mean that. I just think that once you can like kind of see it from the different angle and then incorporate it, that's when you start to realize, like, oh, okay, wow, there's like a whole new world happening here. So
Right.
it's pretty incredible.
Yeah, and just this is kind of a random thought, but two things come up around it. One is that, this is part of sort of the bringing back of old traditions.
Yeah.
Because this is not new. This isn't some wacky, weird, new age thing. This is something that's been around for thousands of years and it's being rediscovered. and sort of reclaimed in a way. And it all, just from a astrology point of view, I just have to, it's interesting to me that, you know, we've had these eclipses along the Libra Aries axis. Libra rules the kidneys, you know, and so here Venus also, and Venus rules Libra, and Venus is in Taurus in her home sign. And so I think, you know, thinking about like maybe you weren't ready, but maybe we weren't as a collective sort of ready to get on this bandwagon, because just looking at your podcast and knowing Emily starting it and your friend starting it, I think it's sort of re-emerging, right? As is a lot of this, and it's just going to take people experimenting with it, paying attention, as you point out, and we'll see where it goes. To me, it's just cool, the idea of reclaiming something that's been around forever, and that maybe it was consciously suppressed by, you know, the whoever, maybe it wasn't. But now people, I mean, talk about accessible healthcare and accessible wellness. It's like what you said. I mean, it's pretty darn accessible.
Oh yeah, man. And abundance. Just think
Yeah,
about the abundance. Like,
right.
yeah, like now I'm starting to collect it so I can age it, so I can have like different, things from this month and that month and 2 weeks old and however many weeks old. And I'm just like realizing how much urine we put out in a day. And it's like, wow, and I don't drink many other things besides like water, tea, occasional coffee and stuff. So we're not like definitely not soda drinkers or anything like that, but it's just like just literally on the basic sort of liquid consumption, I'm like blown away and how much urine that we produce. And so there's also some sort of abundance thing going on, which is to me another indication that I want to keep doing it, because it's the opposite of scarcity. And so anytime that I can like find that and click that in, that helps me to reinforce leaving that scarcity programming behind and trying not to get into it, because there's all sorts of things in a day that can get you back into scarcity, and that's okay. But like to be able to get yourself out of that is like the key, because it's almost inevitable, the world we live in and how it's set up, and just like us as physical beings, to avoid a scarcity thought in a day. And it's not just about avoiding and closing yourself off from it. It's like when you find one within or something hits you, being able to see that difference and being like, no, 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 okay, I'm going into a scarcity spiral, let's exit this one and try and spiral over here. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that I mean, the programming around scarcity is so intense in our culture, and it's in everything. It's hard to recognize it.
It
Yeah.
is, yeah. It creeps in there because you don't even notice it until it's hindsight, or you're
Yeah.
stepped back. That is like, holy moly, that was actually total scarcity. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay. Well, I feel like we probably should wrap up, although, you know, we I know we could talk longer, but I'd love to know, is there anything else that you kind of had in your notes that you wanted to make sure we covered today? Because it's been a wonderful conversation. I love where we've gone.
Yeah, ditto. This is so fun. And I feel like we could keep going too, but we'll just like I said in the other episode when we talked on my show, we'll just rack up the episodes. We'll just
We'll do it again.
we'll do it again. Well, I did want to give one reference book for people. Now, this is the first herbal book that I ever got. This is Wise Woman Herbal Wise Healing Wise by Susan Weed. This is kind of one of the, if you are new to the wise woman tradition, she does a wonderful job of explaining it. She also goes through the other traditions, which are the heroic tradition and the scientific tradition. So the three traditions of healing. This is a classic book. So a lot of people have this book who are interested in herbalism. Susan Weed is one of the pioneer herbalists in like the mainstream herbal community that really pushes not just pushes, but she lives the wise woman tradition basically. But there are other herbalists that are doing it as well. But it's such a great book, and she really just dives deep into more of the primordial tradition that's linked to it, at like blood mysteries and the void and the sacred feminine, and that we're all like of the feminine. We all come from the feminine. We all return to the feminine. That is really strong in her book, and I really appreciate it. I was just rereading some of the sections because I've read this book a couple times already, but like just rereading to refresh. And I'm like, oh my God, the way she explains it is really great. So she's a good resource. And so is Barbara Walker, who she's like a symbologist. She has the Encyclopedia of Women's Symbols. Mario actually has quite a bit of her information and wisdom and tied into his work in symbolic studies. And the crone is another thing that's just tied into all this. So that would be, those are good like jumping off points, I would say. But if anything, just allow yourself to flow into the areas that you think you should be in when it comes to the realm of herbalism, and don't feel like you have to fit into a certain box, because I think that herbs and plants and mother nature, she doesn't want us to be in a box. That's the other thing about the wise woman tradition that I really love, is that the symbol that's typically associated with it is a spiral. It's not a circle, it's not a square, it's not a triangle, it's a spiral, because it reminds us that this is continuously moving, ever changing. We're always changing. Nature's always changing. The world's changing. You know, it's just like it's inevitable. And so that's one of the more humbling parts of this one, of the wise woman tradition to me, too, is that it's okay and just keep going. Continue to go and find your voice in it. And I think the plants and the methods and how you communicate with the plants, it will present itself. It'll become clear where your position is within that realm. And yeah, just don't fear it and allow it to kind of show you the way. And you'll do a really great work when you do that, instead of trying to like fit a certain demographic or what have you. And the people that want to learn from you will find you. And if you put yourself out authentically, and that's been one of my biggest learning lessons too. You know, if I'm going outward with the things that I'm confident and sure about, and I have like a very solid foundation with, I've just found that those are the people that are coming to me, and that's the information that they want. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And that can go across the board with anything you're doing really in life.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It all comes back to just sort of authentically putting yourself out there and your unique form of weird, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, that's great. So, so we'll put something in the description about finding you, but it's Michelle's Healing Home, both the podcast and your website. And you sell some products as well. So, and I know it's not always the same because of our conversation, but you've got some products out there that you're selling as well, including I noticed shampoo bars,
Yes.
other things. So thought that was cool.
Yeah. So michelleshealinghome.com is my website. So you can be linked to the podcast through there. You can find my online store. And then I also have a full moon offerings newsletter that comes out on every full moon. And I've been doing that now for this coming issue will be issue 45. So it's been a few years in the running of putting this out. And so that is the best way to know what's going on in terms of what I have to offer, my recent appearances, what's coming up. But yeah, small batch artisan creations that come around maybe once or twice a year, and then sometimes I have constants like my soap and shampoo. That's one of my favorite things to make is soap. So I typically have soap around, and tinctures and all sorts of stuff. So yeah, michelleshealinghome.com for all of that stuff, and then the Healing Home podcast on YouTube and Spotify. And yeah, I think that's about it. You can also find me on Instagram as well, and Rumble.
Yeah, I know these days there's not like one place, right? We're all over the map. Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. Well, thank you again. This has just been such a delight to have you on the podcast and to talk about real natural wisdom. Yeah, I love
Yeah,
that.
thank you, Christine. I love this. I can't wait to talk more. And these are some of my favorite subjects to talk about. So I'm always down, and I'm honored to have been a guest. And I hope your audience enjoys it. And I look forward to the next one.
Great. That sounds great. And yeah, and thank you to those listening to the podcast. You can find us all over. I'm starting to put myself up on YouTube, but it's always on my website. And than most podcast platforms. So thank you to the people who listen and support the podcast. And we will, yep, I'll talk to you again soon.